Today's lecture is going to deal primarily with the 1970s, most specifically with some policies as well as ideologies that developed in earnest during this decade and how it's affected subsequent eras. Before we begin to understand the 1970s, it's important to understand the preceding decade, the 1960s, which was truly chaotic. Domestically, it was defined most significantly by LBJ's civil rights reform that came in both the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, or gender, as well as the Voting Rights Act of the following year, which did away with discriminatory voting measures such as property owning requirements, literacy tests, or poll tax that had been used primarily in the South dating back to Reconstruction. The Great Society was another step towards this war on poverty that Johnson talked about a lot. One piece was a Head Start program that is still in place today, which provides pre-K schooling primarily to disadvantaged youths in urban centers, but it's also located in rural areas around the country as well. A food stamps program that provided disadvantaged individuals with monetary assistance towards purchasing nutritious food. VISTA, a program that was kind of a domestic Peace Corps, if you will. Remember, the Peace Corps was instituted under JFK, sending American volunteers abroad to help with agricultural, educational, as well as medical aid in the developing world, most prominently in Africa as well as Latin America. But the two primary pieces of the Great Society that are pillars of modern society are Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare, instituted during this era, provided health insurance to people over the age of 65, seeing as many of them were no longer employed and many people received their health care through their employer. A second piece was Medicaid, which provided monetary assistance to poorer people so that if they could not afford medical care out of their own pocket, they would receive some assistance in that capacity. The space and arms races also continued during this era. The space race began really in 1957 when the Russians launched Sputnik, a satellite which orbited the Earth. The American program got started shortly thereafter with the Gemini, Mercury, and later the Apollo programs. And the arms race had been in effect since the late stages of World War II when the United States used atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which eventually led to the Japanese surrender. Something else that was a pillar of the 60s experience was the counterculture. What this means is primarily younger people who were in college or even youth who were very much advocates of programs such as civil rights, the feminist movement, which came about during the 1960s, gay rights, as well as the anti-war movement in Vietnam. These people had far less traditional practices than the older generations. By that, I mean they were a little more liberal with their ideologies about sex as well as relationships, and particularly drug use, which blossomed in the 1960s. Abroad, you start with problems in Cuba towards the beginning of the decade, most notoriously with the Bay of Pigs disaster, which was orchestrated by JFK but really organized under the Eisenhower administration that ended in the fall of 1960. The United States, which had been supporting a dictator and a guy named Fulgencio Bautista in Cuba, was disappointed with the rise of Fidel Castro to power, a communist leader on the island nation that's very close to American borders. Castro had seized American as well as British sugar plantations and nationalized the industry, which meant far less corporate profits. But most significantly, the United States was concerned by the fact that there was a significant communist presence so close to American borders. What the United States did was, instead of sending our own troops to Cuba, we actually trained an exile force of Cubans who had left the nation years earlier to send them back to try to overthrow the Castro administration. Unfortunately, the American trained group was woefully unprepared for both the combat they faced as well as Castro's support. We very much underestimated how popular he was in that country. As a result, the plan backfired. Many of the American trained troops were captured, and this provided a significant embarrassment for the Kennedy administration. But more importantly, it made Castro incredibly paranoid that future American attempts to displace him might continue in subsequent years. So the following year, in October of 1962, there's the Cuban Missile Crisis. Castro actually recruits missiles from Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet Union to protect against an American invasion. And this tips off the Cuban Missile Crisis. Long story short, nuclear war is averted, but This helps in nuclear disarmament in the sense that the United States agrees to remove some of our missiles from Turkey, which is a border country to the Soviet Union, while the Soviets agree to take their weapons out of Cuba. Now, Khrushchev looks much weaker in this scenario or at the end of this crisis than Kennedy because part of the negotiations mandate that the Russians withdraw their missiles right away, while American missiles in Turkey aren't removed until a few months after the fact. So it almost looks like Khrushchev is capitulating to the demands of the American administration. Another event that's of pivotal importance, and we see the long-standing effect of this today, is the Six-Day War in 1967, which involves Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Israel, an American ally since the end of World War II, actually invaded these three border countries because they were under the impression that those countries would have attacked them had they waited and not done anything. This is called a preemptive attack, so not waiting to be the victim of aggression, but launching an attack to prevent something from happening to your own country. And Israel actually increases its territorial holdings during this war. Israel seizes the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, which borders the Suez Canal, which is used as a major waterway by a number of countries to get goods transported all over the world. It seizes the West Bank from Jordan and the Golan Heights from Syria. So Israel is increasing its territorial holdings and upsetting border countries in the process. Another war happens as a result of the Six-Day War 6 years later. We'll talk about that in a subsequent lecture. The Tet Offensive is kind of the landmark event of the Vietnam War in the 1960s. It happens in 1968, and this is really the end of Lyndon Johnson's credibility as a president. The Tet Offensive is a massive uprising organized by the Viet Cong, which is a group of South Vietnamese communists that disrupts and just really creates a sense of chaos in South Vietnam in the opening months of 1968. For the previous 4 years, ever since the American efforts in Vietnam and Southeast Asia had increased dramatically since the Tonkin Gulf incident and the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which provided Johnson with a blank check in that area of the world, the president had been telling the American people that things had been going really well and success was right around the corner. In 1967, Robert McNamara resigned as Secretary of Defense, which left some people scratching their heads. I mean, why would a Secretary of Defense leave his job when things were going well? But the following year with Tet, it's exposed that Johnson really had not been honest with the American people. And this Tet Offensive exposes a credibility gap and causes Lyndon Johnson not to seek re-election, something that's very rare among sitting presidents. So as you can see, there was a lot going on in the 1960s, much of which I didn't even touch on this slide, but by the end of the decade, you start to see some trends emerge that continue into the 1970s. One is a deep mistrust and dissatisfaction with government, evidenced by the Tet Offensive, as well as some people believing that Johnson, via his Great Society programs and civil rights reform, had been overstepping his bounds as national executive. A second consequence that emerges is a collective rattling of the American confidence. While the United States had had inconsistent results in early Cold War policy, it wasn't until Vietnam and Tet where Americans truly began to sense that our prestige abroad had been fading. And that will continue into the 1970s with events in the Middle East, Iran, as well as Afghanistan. Alright, let's begin with talking about domestic policy in the 1970s. Before we do that, I want to first talk about the remarkable success the Democratic Party had from 1932 to 1968. During those years, over a span of 36 years, a Democrat held the presidency for 28 years to a Republican's 8. The only exception to that would be Dwight Eisenhower's two-term presidency from 1952 to 1960 before JFK took over. The fracturing of the New Deal coalition is very important in the context of the rise of the Conservative Party in America. Many white people became increasingly upset with Lyndon Johnson and his focus on minorities. FDR's New Deal was almost exclusively aimed at helping white people. Remember, that was the post-Depression, or actually during the Depression-era policies that were used to put people back to work, as well as reinvigorate the American economy in the wake of the largest financial crisis in our history. Many white people in the South had voted Democratic since Reconstruction. It was called the Solid South because it could so consistently be predicted that they would vote with the Democratic Party. And this is primarily due to the segregationist ideology of people who lived there. For them, Johnson's advocacy of civil rights policies was simply not okay, and they switched their party affiliation to the Republican Party. When Richard Nixon is elected in 1968, he immediately begins to differentiate himself from Lyndon Johnson. Johnson was very much a Federalist president. By that I mean he believed that there should be a strong central government in Washington that should take precedent over individual states. Nixon didn't share that same philosophy. He actually used a program that was known as New Federalism, which was a de-evolution of federalism that shifted power back to the states, primarily with programs like social issues, whether that's education, school desegregation, etc. He wanted to restore political authority to the local level, and that was very attractive, particularly to people in the South that were dismayed by these overarching federal civil rights policies. One example of New Federalism's success involves school desegregation. In 1968, 70% of black students attended all black schools. That's despite the fact that in 1955, the Supreme Court ruled that school desegregation had to occur with all deliberate speed. By 1970, only 18% of black students attended all black schools, and that's directly as a result of Nixon turning over school desegregation to individual states as opposed to having overarching broad federal policies. Just as Nixon tried to tackle social issues via his New Federalism programs, there were many Supreme Court decisions in the 1970s that also had significant effects on social issues. The first was the case of Roe v. Wade in 1973 that dealt with a woman's right to have an abortion. The court ruled that this was inferred in the 14th Amendment that allowed every American citizen right to privacy. Two cases during the middle part of this decade, Furman v. Georgia and Gregg v. Georgia, had to do with the death penalty. Nowadays, states can decide whether or not they support capital punishment. For example, Massachusetts does not have the death penalty, but Texas does. Furman v. Gregg temporarily established a moratorium on death sentences due to inconsistent regulations among states. For example, a person who raped a woman could be sentenced to death in one state, but not in another. Gregg versus Georgia, eradicated those inequalities and restored order, as well as the ability for states to execute inmates. Regents versus Bakke was a case that involved affirmative action at the University of California at Davis. Alan Bakke, the plaintiff, was denied entry to the medical school there, and he believed it was a result of reverse discrimination. Remember, affirmative action is the policy of providing special opportunities for and favoring members of one group over another when those being favored are perceived as a disadvantaged group who suffer from discrimination within a culture. Affirmative action in the 1970s benefited African Americans. In fact, the program at Davis set aside a certain number of spots for African American students every year. This is called a quota system. And the Supreme Court ruled that while the quota system was not acceptable, affirmative action was, in the sense that race could be used as a factor in admission, but not exclusively the one sole factor. Let's talk about foreign affairs. Much like in the 1960s, the Vietnam War continued to frustrate Americans in the 1970s. Tet damaged the credibility of LBJ and exposed the fact that he had been lying to the American people. When Nixon became president, he proposed a shift in fighting responsibility, away from American troops and towards the South Vietnamese. But while using this policy known as Vietnamization, he also began to broaden the war into border countries, bombing Cambodia and Laos, trying to disrupt the supply network from the North Vietnamese to the Viet Cong, which was known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. As a result of these bombings, many students across American campuses began to protest the war, leading to shootings at Kent State University in Ohio, in which National Guardsmen killed a few students, as well as Jackson State in Mississippi a few days later. Perhaps the most significant legacy of the Vietnam War was Congress's passage of the War Powers Act in 1973. Fearful that presidents had disproportionate power in foreign affairs, Congress ensured that the president would have to notify them within 48 hours of committing American troops to any cause, and if there was no progress within a few months, the troops would be forced to come home. This was passed in an effort to prevent another Vietnam from happening. President Nixon tried to overrule this congressional law via a veto, but he was unsuccessful considering Congress acquired the two-thirds vote necessary to overrule the presidential veto. By 1975, considering the fact that American troop presence had lessened in Vietnam and Nixon had begun to focus on other parts of the world, Saigon fell in 1975 and Vietnam was united under a communist government. 1973 saw the sequel to the 1967 Six-Day War. Israel, which had claimed territory from Egypt, Jordan, and Syria 6 years earlier, was faced with an attack by those three countries on Yom Kippur, which is the Jewish Day of Atonement in 1973. The United States, which had been allies with Israel since its founding in the late 40s, provided aid to the Israelis in an effort to deter the Arab attack. However, while that aid was successful and Israel prevented those countries from reclaiming their lost territory, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, decided to establish an embargo, which prevented America from importing foreign oil. That led to massive price increases in oil, but also Nixon established an alternative energy program the following year known as Project Independence. This involved things like the construction of a trans-Alaskan pipeline, trying to get more oil to the continental United States, as well as lowering speed limits so cars would function more efficiently, and installing mass transit systems in cities. However, in 1974, that embargo was lifted. Nixon decided to cancel Project Independence completely, which was a mistake considering future oil shocks would arrive later in that same decade. Another place the United States ran into problems in the late 1970s was Iran. The Shah, a ruler the U.S. had supported since the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in the middle of the 1950s, was forced out of power due to rising Islamic fundamentalism in Iran. Instead of the Shah, the Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile to seize control of the country. Americans in Iran were targeted, and 54 Americans were taken hostage in November of 1978, an ordeal that would last over 440 days. In addition to this, many people stopped working at the oil rigs in the country. As a result, the supply of oil decreased, leading to higher prices abroad, particularly in the United States. So while the first oil shocks arrived after American aid to Israel in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War, the oil shocks towards the end of the decade were even more significant. Furthermore, American credibility was hurt by this hostage crisis because of President Carter's inability to free them. With the crisis lasting over a year, the United States looked impotent in the eyes of the world and created a new enemy in Iran. Let's move on to something else. Realpolitik was a program first introduced by Nixon's National Security Advisor and later turned Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Kissinger believed that instead of focusing American foreign policy on smaller, less influential countries like Vietnam or Korea or in the Middle East, the U.S. should instead focus its attention on world superpowers, such as the Soviet Union and China. Realpolitik literally translates to a realistic foreign policy. And hoping to benefit from the fact that the Soviet Union and China were not on the best terms in the middle of the 1970s, Kissinger began independently negotiating with each country. SALT was the landmark policy of an era known as détente, which was a period of relative peace between the US and the Soviet Union. SALT stood for the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, and this began the process of nuclear de-escalation that would continue into the early 1990s, with the INF Treaty under Ronald Reagan and the START Treaty under George H.W. Bush. In China, Nixon was the first president to visit the Far East since the 1950s. Now, Nixon was a strong anti-communist dating back to his time in the House of Representatives, so he could get away with visiting China. There's no denying that Nixon was brilliant. However, his moral shortcomings led to his downfall. The Watergate crisis, in which Nixon obstructed justice and later was forced to resign the presidency, exposed him as a man who didn't respect the constitutional balance of power. He was an imperial president and believed in that program of the executive acting as an emperor-like figure. However, with Watergate coupled with the War Powers Act, it was obvious that Congress was tired of presidents overstepping their boundaries. No longer would Congress tolerate presidents sending troops abroad without their consent, nor committing various crimes like Nixon did when he authorized the break-in of the Democratic National Headquarters leading up to the 1972 election. Let's quickly cover some of the themes we've addressed so far. One is the waning of American power abroad. The Vietnam War was obviously not successful for the United States. Vietnam became a unified communist country and is the first war in the modern era that we had lost as a country. In Iran, you saw Americans held hostage, as well as Carter's inability to free them over a course of over a year. In Afghanistan, the Soviet Union invaded that country in 1979, and Carter was powerless to do anything about it. The US also began a new Cold War policy with the Soviets known as détente, a period of peaceful coexistence and de escalation of the arms race, evidenced by the SALT Treaty in 1972. We also saw the beginning of trouble in the Middle East. While we supported Israel when they were attacked by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in 1973, that led to a series of oil shocks, which increased the price of that raw material and had long standing consequences for America throughout the remainder of the decade. We also did not have a cohesive foreign policy in the Middle East the way we did in Europe with containment policy, leading to further instability. And lastly, we began to see many New Deal Democrats switch political parties. Some were strongly anti Soviet, primarily Lithuanians, Poles, and other people from Eastern Europe, and were concerned by the fact that they viewed the United States as adopting more conciliatory foreign policy. Others felt abandoned by what has become, or what had become, a minority centric party, focused more on the rights of feminists and civil rights than of ordinary blue collar white Americans. Others were against racial equality and forced integration. Thanks for watching. Please come to class on Monday with any questions you have over this related content.